Well, I got the idea to write the book early in the previous decade. Around 2000, I had been teaching a course to the pastoral theology students at Boston College on the pastoral care of the sick, the order of Christian funerals, the pastoral care of the dying, and also the sacrament of penance, reconciliation. The course met annually. I offered it annually for several years and proved to be one of the more popular ones in the curriculum at the time. So it became clear to me that this was meeting a need in the life of the church and for the kinds of work that these pastoral ministers were doing. But what also became clear to me was that the research and auxiliary reading I was doing to prepare really good sessions beyond the reading for the students was fascinating material. And so as I moved into my first sabbatical in 2003, 2004, I began really working earnestly on the project. The title Divine Worship and Human Healing actually was the course title that I had come up with. And it, to my mind and to the minds of some of the students, it really sings in a way. Divine and human, pairing those in relation to worship and healing, often I found people think that somehow these should be opposed. If we're talking about God, it's something far greater other than the human being. Or if we're talking about humans, it's what they aren't in relationship to God. Granted, there are great differences between the two in Christian belief and Christian tradition, but crucial to the tradition as well is the belief, the revelation we believe, that God is known precisely through what God is doing with humanity and in humanity. So I hope that it's a productive tension. Or certainly it was in my teaching and then in my crafting the project over several years. Worship and healing likewise, I discovered over and again that Roman Catholics, practicing Catholics, even other Christians would say to me, well, we don't particularly think of worship as healing. Or how would these two things be related? Isn't worship what you do when you're talking to God, when you're doing stuff for God, you're praising God? And yet, in the most ancient of Christian tradition, the sacraments, the rituals of the church, are described or taught by the church fathers as God's ways of healing the human condition, and in fact raising the human condition up to a participation or a sharing in the life of God. So, in the end, I hope that the title, all four of the terms, the adjectives divine and human, the substantives worship and healing, invite people to get into the creative tension of the book itself. The audience of the book, who I wrote the book for, obviously, first of all, was inspired by students. So the master's level students working in areas of theology, pastoral ministry, people that are well educated but not necessarily specialists. Well educated meaning whether that be through a liberal arts education or further theological education, that people could pick the book up and it be written lucidly enough that they could follow it, they could work with it. It's a scholarly book. The number of footnotes seems to attest to that. I tried to move a great deal of the technical theological material into the footnotes so that the text itself, the body of the text, can read more fluidly. Likewise, I use a lot of narrative in the book. I try to introduce at places stories or scenarios that will help people to envision what the more systematic and historical material, philosophical material is trying to get at. So, for a scholarly audience, in fact, some of my peers who've already read the book and kindly emailed me about it are very excited and say it seems to present a very fresh approach to the methodology of our discipline, the content of our discipline. At the same time, my target really was a wider audience. My joy would be if it gets course adoption, that's what gives a book some legs. To focus on rituals concerning illness and dying and death may sound morbid, but in fact, I think for all of us, whatever our current backgrounds or religious heritages or not, we recognize that we humans really get at what most matters to us in our lives when we face these marginal problems and challenges and these situations. Whether for ourselves, we don't want to think, though, just in terms of the autonomous Enlightenment individual, not just ourselves, but rather the people we love and care about. We ourselves, the baby boomers, caring for our parents in their late and now very extended years with great challenges concerning their health care, their overall health, their mental health, etc., would be just one example. Couples, married couples, in every direction of relationships, it's the times of these sorts of crisis or great change that put in such stark relief what it is that we believe, what it is we're hanging on to for dear life, what we maybe have never bothered to consider, and in turn, I think attunes us to the content of religious traditions that we otherwise would neglect or ignore. All of a sudden it matters. So one more thing about the book then, I became convinced over the years of researching and writing it that the challenge for us in the early 21st century, at least in our social cultural context, might be to rediscover why practicing certain elements of the tradition actually is a way of practicing or rehearsing the resources that may very well be useful when we find ourselves in those more marginal or crisis type situations. Yes, the word mystery pervades the book, and perhaps just as in the title, my hope as a writer was to intrigue the reader, get the reader thinking. Likewise with the word mystery, the polyvalence of the term, the multiple levels of meaning and possibility in the term, positive, negative, inviting, prohibiting or restricting, it bespeaks limits again, in fact, as do these rituals, human limits. For all those reasons, mystery seems apt, but likewise from within my discipline of liturgical and sacramental theology, the concept of mystery has been the central conceptual locus for the renewal of the theology in the past century. An adjective's applied to it, paschal mystery. Pascha is the adjective referring to Passover. For Christians, that's Easter, the Easter season. Paschal mystery refers to Christ's death and resurrection as the key, really, to the enterprise of the Christian and wider human life. So, on the one hand, I'm trying very hard in the book to be faithful to the liturgical movement and the best of the 20th century scholarship that revised a robust and helpful sacramental theology. On the other hand, I'm trying to take all of that work and make a further contribution by relating it to the challenges that present themselves as mystery in our social cultural context in the beginning of this millennium. The Bible also proves to be an important resource for the text. When I was speaking about mystery, I couldn't do it without referring to the biblical content of the faith, namely the Church's belief and understanding raised from the texts of the Gospels. Jesus' death and resurrection being the central passion narratives, but then one backs up into the entirety of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, discovering, as I did with the help of all the great biblical scholarship that's been produced, especially over the past century and continues, discovering that, for example, in Mark's Gospel, fully 47% of the content of the Gospel itself, just the sheer body of text, 47% are narratives of healing. Jesus healing people, raising from the dead, all these different scenarios. This is no small thing. It all of a sudden comes to me in my research at the time as a clue that I'm onto something. And yet it poses a great challenge or problem because for us who live in modernity, post-Enlightenment, even in the late modernity, the notion or the imagery of the miracle stories in the Gospels look like fairy tales, like fanciful stories. Things happen so abruptly and seemingly magically that this set me on a lot of reading and research, which I spent actually the entire fall of '06 on a research fellowship in Ireland doing. Not that the books were only in Ireland, but it was where an institution gave me the place to do it. But just digging in to, as much as I could, digging into the biblical scholarship on Jesus the healer, and then letting that speak to the Church's belief that Christ heals now in the rituals. Something that I did not expect in the early stages of my research and writing of the book, and this would be almost a decade ago now, was the great crisis produced in Boston and Massachusetts in the Northeast, produced by the allocations, the revelations of priests abusing children sexually, others abusing children sexually, as well as the maelstrom that followed in terms of how the hierarchy handled it, etc. Why that mattered to me was I started to notice, as I was reading the Boston Globe and other form of media, constantly noticed that people were using the language of healing. People from all sides of the crisis would discuss healing as the goal, healing as the objective, healing as what was being obstructed. So it seemed to me that, indeed, as theology's project, the academic theologian's project is always to try to take the content of Scripture and tradition and make that viable and in service to people today. All of a sudden I realized, wow, I've got in front of me here the term healing. I've got to pay attention to how it's being used, and being used so pervasively by people in a very specific situation that's a church situation. So it was nothing I was looking for, and yet at least I had eyes to see and ears to hear, and I realized, oh, look at that. So this coincided that year with my working on a project further west out at Holy Cross with an anthropologist and a medievalist. We were working on a project about Catholicism and ritual, and my angle was coming in with the healing material because some of the medievalists were dealing with healing in the Middle Ages and so forth. It's a longer point. But we got involved in a part of the project that we got involved with in that conference was to do a Mass of the anointing of the sick. And in working with campus ministry there, which I think would, the student body, the actors would not be that different from BC, we discovered a lot of resistance to people, on the part of people, their resistance to the notion that the Church's rites for the pastoral care of the sick would be relevant to anybody other than someone dying. And to try to open up the language of healing with regard to the rites, I found faced great resistance on the part of lay people, but also especially among the priests. And so the question became all the more pointed for me. What do people mean by healing? And I discovered, as I really deconstructed the quotes and the texts in the different journal and newspaper and magazine articles, a wealth of insights were there to be tapped. That led me to read work by cultural anthropologists. There's a whole subdiscipline called medical anthropology I discovered, as well as some other critical social theorists, interdisciplinary work that supplemented what I was reading and ended up constructing a whole chapter I didn't expect on the front end of the book, constructing this notion of healing through a contemporary lens. Theology today works so hard at situating the practice of faith and the questions of the content of faith in contexts. And to do that has led also to a recognition of how bodily enacted is the practice of faith by any peoples. Body, therefore, for Roman Catholic and wider Christian theology in the early 21st century, is not just an idea that derives from the prevalence of body in other postmodern discourses and research, but also body presents itself as a renewing category to again advance theology into a postmodern mode of its own, a post-Enlightenment deliverance from thinking of the faith only as tenets to be argued, texts to be defended, creeds to be recited. For sacramental and liturgical theologians, since our concern are the rituals of the Church as they relate to the wider life of the Church, then body becomes an all the more obvious category. I've tried to work with that category in my previous writing and continue so, but when one looks at the crises of illness, dying, and death, the body becomes all the more prevalent. The chapter that I wrote on the funerals toward the end of the book, I found eventually a way to get a handle on the complexity of what goes on in the momentous event of the death of a loved one and all the related actors and contexts, was to parse out the types of bodies that are in action or in motion, and to realize with the help of certain religious historians and phenomenologists and a French sacramental theologian whom I greatly admire, Louis-Marie Chauvet, with the help of all of them, that any one of us in our own bodiliness are multiple types of body, or there's polyvalence to our bodiliness. We're physical bodies for sure. We live, function in the cosmos physically, and are affected by it and affecting it. But we're also social bodies. The fact that I'm sitting here in a jacket and tie is the most obvious way to describe I function in the social body of North Atlantic, academic, certain social class, etc. But that feeds into so many other dimensions of culture and context. So our bodies are socially constructed and we contribute. The third category is the traditional body. In some ways, a subcategory of the social and cultural. Traditional refers to those aspects of how we live bodily that we are least quick to change. And ironically, very often are described as natural. Well, it's just natural that you do X or Y. We discover that what the word natural really means is, thus has it always been done, and we are not lightly to toy with this. Roman Catholicism, then, is rife with tradition. It's a traditional body, and yet also a social body, contextualized in given places. Further, you have the specificity of gender roles and all the other aspects of the physical but-social but-traditional body. So in the book, for example, I was just trying to note the funerals, I'm able to get a better analytical approach, or I was able to arrive at an analytical approach by parsing out the different dimensions of bodiliness and then addressing how it is that, at this point, at least in the United States for Roman Catholics, people are drawing on elements of traditional Catholic funeral rites and yet insisting that other cultural practices now be inserted. Language like a celebration of a life, people even introducing video footage, many different ways that we now culturally and socially want to remember. A final dimension in my research that was a delightful turn, and again a surprise to me, was to get into the whole very current notion of green burial, and to learn that in Great Britain, over 10% of burials now are green burials, meaning people are not even in a cardboard coffin, let alone a metal or a wooden one, but are simply wrapped in gauze or something biodegradable, and they're buried in certain designated, I forget the language right now, but designated wilderness or arboretum preserves. And the idea is your body recontributes to the cycle of the cosmos of life. That's highly compatible, actually, with Christian theology. So part of what I want to propose toward the end of the chapter are ways in which living tradition can become living tradition and not be threatened by other cultural and social movements, but rather work with them creatively and expect to be surprised. I concluded the book with a narrative description with which originally I thought I would start the book. It's a tale of when I was on sabbatical in '04, of my having gone out to Brittany in the northwestern coastal region of France to spend a few days exploring the prehistoric megaliths in the region of Karnak. These are probably dating at least back to 8,000 BC. Rows and rows of monumental stones. The stones haven't been carved in any way, but clearly these massive stones have been brought and erected or put up as upright as possible, sometimes kilometer-long rows of these rolling over the hills. To me, just seeing them from up above on higher hills, it was breathtaking. There was something just about the order of it. Likewise, in that region are many burial passageway grave sites. And it's quite charming in a sense that some of these are just literally in people's front yards, or you can just access them in the corner of a town square. I have a degree in anthropology. Before I did my PhD in religion and systematic theology, I followed the advice of an undergrad mentor and did an anthropology degree. And so I wanted to go see these sites, but again, unexpectedly discovered they were having a big affect on me. And in the evenings, I'd sit and write a journal on my own bodily reflections, experiences, how my thoughts ran insofar as I was already researching and writing this book on worship and healing, life, death, illness. What did these silent, millennia-old passage graves and absolutely enigmatic alignments of rocks, there's no agreement on what purpose they served, what insights would that provide? My editor told me, this won't work as the introductory chapter of the book because she said, I don't know why this is here. So we put it aside, but as I finished the book, I realized, it becomes in a way a parable or a story through which I can tie up what I've tried to do for 250 pages. How? For example, those alignments, I had learned that among theories for what the rocks are about were that it was a calendar, that these were somehow aligning with the lunar and solar and all these other sorts of cycles. And, well, could that be? There's strength and weakness in the description. The Church, the Roman Catholic Church historically tried to eliminate a lot of them because they saw them as phallic and they were used by the peasants as springtime, May Day sort of ritual sites or fun sites, fertility sites. Maybe you see where I'm going. Again, all those layers of bodiliness start to interact, and these strange silent stones become a lesson in how we're always constructing and reconstructing our engagement with the physical world and with one another, with our history and with our future. So I end up with what my editor had initially described as something I should submit to National Geographic. It ends up being a way, I hope, in an engaging way, a narrative that helps the reader to imagine how they might go out into the world and recognize similar situations and start to reflect on all those different dimensions of bodiliness in their own lives and world. One other term I introduce in the text and repeat in places, and in fact play with very strongly in that conclusion, is the concept of treasure. And in fact, to be more specific, I like to speak or write about squandered treasure. It seems to me that the revised rites of the current Roman Catholic Church that have been beautifully, I think they've been beautifully designed to serve people in great need, in sickness and aging, dying, and death, it seems to me that these have been squandered a lot. They've been enacted, they've been official for over 2 decades, and yet so often, to my own observation, what happens is the priest or other pastoral minister simply says a prayer for somebody, and these texts languish. The texts, of course, are there to become alive in the actual care and work with people. And so a passion behind the book is perhaps also a certain measure of my own indignation. You know, there's probably a little anger in there even, which wouldn't be surprising given my personality. indignation that these very carefully researched and constructed rituals are being neglected or squandered, hence squandered treasure. They're based on all those years of research into the early church's materials, trying to recover a kind of approach to the faith that's not just about ideas and arguments. It seems to all be ready to answer and serve a postmodern or late modern people. And so I suppose in the end it's a rhetoric or an apologia to convince people that here is a treasure, here's a collection of tools or resources that we would be foolish not to take from the storehouse and enjoy the use of.